Joe Biden actually recently had an interview with 60 Minutes. This has been making a lot of news because Joe Biden has not given as many interviews, and actually it's been pretty quiet on his side for quite some time. And I said before, I think they're trying to hide Joe Biden, obviously, because it's very clear that he's having difficulty communicating, right? So I feel like they're trying to keep him as quiet as much as possible. But what we want to focus on in this interview is in reference to Israel and Palestine. Now, I have two clips that I want to show. The first one is in reference to whether or not Joe Biden believes that Gaza will be occupied, that Israel will try to occupy Gaza, and whether or not he believes that is the right idea. Now, there has been a statement that was released from the state of Israel saying that they're not trying to occupy Gaza, but we've heard these things before, right? Listen to what Joe Biden says. I think you might be surprised by this.
Would you support Israeli occupation of Gaza at this point?
I think it'd be a big mistake. Look, what happened in Gaza, in my view, is Hamas and the extreme elements of Hamas don't represent all the Palestinian people.
Let's just pause there for a second. I was very surprised that this was the statement that he gave in reference to that particular question. And I have to tell you, and we'll go back through it, because I have to tell you this much. I honestly believe all of the protests that have happened all across the world, not just in the United States, and I'm going to show you what they look like in a second as well. I really do feel like that power on the outside, like the people in the streets, particularly a lot of the younger people that have been leading the way, I feel like that has kind of shifted things a bit. Not just the criticism that has come from people online. I'm talking about the movement of people in the streets that are willing to see this for what it really is. The people who are calling out the occupation, the people who are calling out a genocide. Those people have been very loud and very vocal. And like I said, this has been happening globally, not just in the United States. And I really do believe that before Joe Biden did this interview, he was already given a talking to about where he should stand in particular and how he should describe the Palestinian people. Because a lot of people, a lot of commentators over the past couple of weeks on mainstream media, they are referring to the Palestinians as Hamas, and they're not the same thing. There's one group that is Hamas, and then you have the Palestinian people. And I think it's really important that mainstream media try to correct that narrative. And they weren't doing that in the beginning. They were saying it as though they're all the same thing, and they're not all the same thing. That would be like someone who's not from the United States thinking that all of us are like the people who participated in the insurrection January 6th. Now, all Americans like that? Did all Americans participate in that? No, we did not. So we have to be careful how we try to paint these generalizations over a broad group of people based on the actions of few. I think that is very important. Let's continue, and then we'll go back, because I was actually surprised he said that.
And I think that it would be a mistake for Israel to occupy Gaza again. But to going in and taking out the extremists, the Hezbollah is up north, but Hamas down south is a necessary requirement.
Would you support?
So here's the problem with that part right there. He said going in and just taking out that particular group. That is not what's been happening. What's been happening is that there are attacks on, we just found out about this today. There was a hospital that was attacked. In the past, there have been schools that have been attacked, a number of civilian casualties that have happened. It's not like they're going in and seeking out just that particular group. They're doing like these large scale attacks, which obviously is going to cause civilian casualties. So when Joe Biden says that, we have to understand, again, that is not what is happening. Last time I checked the numbers, it was over 3,000 people in Palestine. Civilian casualties now, over 3,000. You have to remember there are 2 million people. We're 2 million people in Gaza. over half of them are children. So this is something to keep in comparison. When people try to compare the casualties with Israel and Palestine, you have to remember every time there are always more casualties on the Palestinian side. Because who has the technology? Who has all the resources? The state of Israel does, not Palestine. But this part right here was particularly interesting.
Or Israeli occupation of Gaza at this point?
I think it'd be a big mistake. Look.
So he thinks it's a mistake for Israel to try to occupy Gaza. Now, why is that important? President Biden is actually planning to visit Israel, I believe sometime this week, from what I saw. But the reason that he's going there is to get them to convince Netanyahu to push the humanitarian aid through. So we have to remember again, for those who are in Gaza that have not been a part of the casualties in reference to the war, right? They still have to deal with the fact that they're not getting food and they're not getting water and they don't have electricity. That includes electricity for hospitals as well. So in a sense, it's like if you are not a casualty of the war itself, you could still be a casualty because of starvation or because of dehydration. You can only go so long without water. You can only go so long without food. So that is why Biden is going there. He's not going there to say, hey, cut this out. He's going there to convince Netanyahu to allow them to push the humanitarian aid through to the people of Gaza so those people don't starve or they don't die from dehydration. And then he says this part.
What happened in Gaza, in my view, is Hamas and the extreme elements of Hamas don't represent all the Palestinian people.
And then that part right there. So I would imagine that, again, I think Joe Biden was giving a talking to before this interview and was told to say that because mainstream media has been using the narrative and it gets across to Americans that like all of the Palestinian people are that way. Now, where have we seen this before? I saw it after 9/11. For those of us who remember what happened after 9/11, there was this narrative that was spread across mainstream media to make people think that all people over there were like that all Iraqis were that way. And that's what people would think, right? So I would not be surprised if Joe Biden was not prepped before this interview to say, make sure you explain to people that there is a difference between Hamas and the Palestinian people and not to refer to them as one thing. Now, I want to show you another part of this interview. There's a discussion that came up about whether or not the United States government at this point in time can afford to fund two wars. That's the war in Ukraine and the Israel and Palestine war. Remember, the United States government has been giving billions of dollars to Ukraine. Weapons, even a healthcare package was in one of those packages that they sent over there. Clean water was in one of those packages that were sent over there. They've been sending them billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine. And now the United States government has committed to also sending money and weapons to the state of Israel. So the question comes up, can the U.S. government afford to handle two conflicts of war at the same time? Listen to this.
Are the wars in Israel and Ukraine more than the United States can take on at the same time?
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense.
Okay. I had to play this because I just want to do a gotcha moment. If Joe Biden is admitting to you that the U.S. government can afford to take care of both of those conflicts at the same time in reference to aid, then that tells you that the U.S. government can afford to give everybody health care in this country. You see, he lets the cat out the bag when you tell people what the U.S. government can actually afford. And I'd push back on this because this is a little bit different. We're talking about sending weapons over there. Isn't it only amount of time before the weapons that we have in the United States are depleted? Then what happens? Yes, of course, military contractors can create more weapons as they do. But is the president of the United States going to allow for the U.S. weapons to completely deplete? No. He's not going to allow for the U.S. government not to have any weapons left at all, which means at some point or another, he's going to either have to say no to Zelensky or Netanyahu. Now, Zelensky's already crying and feeling like he's not getting enough attention because this conflict is now happening. And you guys know how I feel about this particular issue. The United States government should not be the world's bank. The U.S. government shouldn't be the world's police. The U.S. government should not be involved in these conflicts abroad. But here we are. Now, we got ourselves into this mess, not you and I personally, but our government got ourselves into this mess. Now, if the U.S. government doesn't fulfill or has to back off for financial reasons, it's only a matter of time before Zelensky is mad at us or Netanyahu is mad at us. This is what happens when you intervene. Let him continue.
We have the capacity to do this, and we have an obligation to. We are the essential nation, as to paraphrase the former Secretary of State. And if we don't,
I don't even know what that meant. I don't even know what this meant. What he said here.
Overall international defense. We have the capacity to do this, and we have an obligation to. We are the essential nation, as to paraphrase the former Secretary of State.
We are the what? We are the former nation to what? Secretary of State? What does that even mean?
And if we don't, who does?
Are the wars?
That's not our problem. That part right there, if we don't, who does? Why are we worried about what other people are doing? There is a split, though. There is a little rift that's happening now. I'm going to show you what Janet Yellen said in reference to whether or not America can afford another war. And then I'm going to give you my opinion about the way that this is even being discussed on these news outlets, which is something that I think is the elephant in the room that is not a part of the discussion. And I'm pretty sure they wouldn't be able to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it. But let's get into what Janet Yellen says about whether or not we can afford another war.
What this all means. Paul Tudor-Jones, the famed investor, was on CNBC this week, and he said, "This is the most threatening and challenging geopolitical environment that I've ever seen. At the same time, the US is in its weakest fiscal position since World War II, with debt to GDP at 122%. Can America, can the West afford another war at this time?"
I think the answer is absolutely. America can certainly afford to stand with Israel and to support Israel's military needs.
You got to know who this is. So this is Janet Yellen. She's another war hawk. So of course she's going to say that, right? Oh, absolutely. We can afford to do both. War hawks. What is the question that they should ask? When you look at the 60 Minutes interview and you look at this interview on the Sky News, instead of asking, or if you're going to ask that question, can the U.S. government afford two wars at the same time monetarily? Shouldn't you actually ask, why do we have two wars under this president? Why is the U.S. government involved in two international conflicts under this president? Two international conflicts that started under this president. Now we can go back and we can say like when this conflict started with Israel and Palestine, really started back 1970s. We can get into all that. But the actual war started under Joe Biden. The Russia-Ukraine war started under Joe Biden. So I think the question that these commentators should ask is, why did this president in particular get us into two wars at the same time? Maybe at the same time, but under his presidency. How did he allow two wars under his presidency? And I hope everybody remembers this when it's time to vote in 2024. Two. Not a fan of Donald Trump at all. Donald Trump also sent aid to Ukraine. Also participated in drone strikes. But the point that a lot of people make is that he didn't start any new wars. We have two under Joe Biden. Warhawk.
And we also can and must support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. And look, the American economy is doing extremely well.
That is not true. So you see how they just tell these lies. The American economy is doing extremely well. Is that what you guys see? Grocery store prices are still high. We talked about the economy. We've talked about this for a long time. The homelessness crisis in this country has increased by 25%. 10 communities all across the country. But the economy is doing really well, according to Janet Yellen. But see, they all have to tell this lie. They all have to tell this lie because if they get on there and they say the economy is not doing well, then that's not good for Joe Biden. My comrade Nick from RBN had something to say about Janet Yellen. This is really good. I think Nick nailed it on this.
Janet Yellen, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, just recently said the U.S. economy is doing so well that we can fund wars in Palestine and in Ukraine. So as Bidenomics continue to fail in the eyes of the American people, instead of addressing those concerns, the Biden administration is pushing for funding endless war. Last year, Janet Yellen was nominated as one of the Times People of the Year. Liberals loved her and praised her because she was the first female Secretary of Treasury. Doesn't it just warm your heart that we finally have a female in charge that is calling for funding endless war? This is what progress looks like. There is not enough conversation about how absolutely unhinged the Biden administration cabinet is. The Biden administration cabinet is filled with swamp monsters like this liberal girl boss, Janet Yellen, Lloyd Austin, and Anthony Blinken. This is even more concerning since we know Biden is a brain-dead, demented puppet. So essentially the executive branch is controlled by a bunch of psychopaths.
And the point that Nick is addressing here, this whole idea of we have a first female this, or we have the first African-American person in this position ever. People focus on just the identity part, that they don't pay attention to what that person is actually doing while they're in that position. Janet Yellen is just another war hog, right? So when there is that stress and that expression about their identity, it's easier for people to ignore how they're actually doing their job. Interesting times, folks.
In fact, Biden's cabinet was essentially selected by WestExec, an organization that represents corporations and help rehabilitate war criminals. The goal of the Democratic Party and the neoliberal agenda is to create a police state in the United States, building cop cities and supermax prisons while funding never-ending wars. This is the liberal focus as millions of people don't have health care, millions of people are homeless, and millions of people are food insecure. We are living through an era of late-stage capitalism and the decline of the empire. And like previous empires, the United States is ignoring their own people so they can wage endless war.
That's what it's about. All of the needs that Americans have in this country, not paying attention to us, instead paying attention to, what's happening abroad. They can easily decrease that defense budget, which is over $860 billion. And they could fund a lot of these issues that we have in this country, but they don't want to. Because again, like I said, they feel like that's not profitable, but it actually could be profitable, because when you take care of your people and the people are doing well, they're getting the jobs, they're able to feed their families, they're able to, actually have a future. If we look at the Gen Z group, they're actually able to have a future. They're able to buy a house. They're able to get married. They're able to start families. That in turn is invested back into the economy. When we do well, the economy does well. We're not doing so well right now. Not doing so well. Now, there is a split, whether it's the Democrat side or the Republican side. There's the split in reference to how much the U.S. should participate in reference to the Israel and Palestine conflict. Should the U.S. be involved at all? There's a split on the Republican side between people like Vivek Ramaswamy and Ron DeSantis. And there's a split on the Democrat side between people like Joe Biden and people like Rashida Tlaib. We're going to get to her in a second. She's speaking out against this as well. So there is a split in both parties in reference to whether or not the U.S. should actually get involved in this conflict, and if so, if they should take a side or not. Vivek Ramaswamy recently was on Louder with Crowder, who I'm not a fan of this guy either. But Vivek Ramaswamy was asked about the conflict with Israel and Palestine in reference to if the United States government should get involved. Now, I've seen him flip-flop on this, because at one point in the interview, I heard him say that, well, yes, we should support the state of Israel. But in this interview, he's saying something a little bit different. Listen to this.
Talked about this, obviously, in the last couple of weeks, or the last week or so, with Israel-Hamas.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between Ukraine and Russia.
Big difference.
In that Hamas is a terrorist organization where the extermination of all Jews is in their charter. And I don't necessarily
think Israel matters to our national interest more than Ukraine does.
Yes, sure. They do. As a matter of fact, they...
Pause. I hope you caught what Vivek Ramaswamy just said there. He said Israel matters more to our national interests than Ukraine does. Remember that video I played a couple of nights ago? It was Joe Biden giving a speech back when he was a senator, and he said if there wasn't an Israel, the U.S. government would create one. This is really how this works. The U.S. government is going to back those that help its national interest. Let's continue.
Certainly do matter to our national interest. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't an argument to be made, and we ran the numbers. If we cut the funding to all of the nations with who we provide foreign aid to, and by the way, those numbers are always a very low estimate when you actually understand also the incentives, and Israel as well, that they would come out ahead because we fund a bunch of people who want to wipe them off the face of the map, or help Israel a little bit and cut money anyways to places like Iran.
The analogy you're drawing is interesting one. Elon has drawn this analogy with respect to electric vehicle subsidies, where if you got rid of all electric vehicle subsidies, Tesla comes out ahead because the unit economics actually work.
Well, that's because they've sold too many Teslas. That's why they don't get the subsidy anymore. I think it's after 250,000 sold, the subsidy goes away. So it's like, oh, so I sold good cars.
And the unit economics are just more solid in terms of how they're running the operation. So here's what I would say. I think that this is a moment right now, when we're having this conversation now, where we need rational, cool-headed responses to ask, yes, how do we support Israel's own right to its own national self-defense, as Israel is fully entitled to? Yeah. What happened, what Hamas did was barbaric. It was wrong. It was inhumane. It was medieval in its nature.
Mm-hmm. Let me pause here for a second. You notice something that they do? Notice when they do say that Israel has a right to defend itself, you never hear them say that the Palestinians have a right to defend their self. Notice you never hear them say that. A lot of these people, even the ones like Vivek, who claims like the U.S. shouldn't be spending their money in foreign interest abroad, they're only willing to go so far if you pay attention. Because even Vivek is willing to tell you that Israel has a right to defend itself. He's not going to go far enough and say, and the Palestinian people have a right to defend their self. He's not going to go that far. So pay attention to that.
Israel absolutely has the right to national self-existence and to fully defend itself. That's a decision for Israel as to how they go about doing it. And our job is diplomatically, in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of limited circumstances of munition support. That is our job as a partner and ally at the UN. Tell the UN you're not going to draw some false equivalence between Israel's defense.
Ceasefire.
Yeah, exactly. All that nonsense.
Let's pause here for a second. You notice what else I've noticed? They're also willing to point out that Hamas, calling them barbaric and savage and things like that. But they're never willing to do the same about the crimes and the atrocities that have been committed by the state of Israel to the Palestinian people in places like Gaza and the West Bank. I want to be very clear for people who are new to the show. When I'm talking about the state of Israel, I'm talking about the Israeli government. I'm not talking about Jewish people. So this is something that I think that people need to pay attention to. They're never willing to call that out. They're never willing to mention what's been happening to the Palestinian people over the past decades, starting back all the way back in the 1970s. They're never willing to talk about the fact how these people were dragged out of their home. They had guns pointed to their face. Their homes were taken over, and then they were pushed into a small section and told, this is only where you can live. We are going to fence you in. Oh, and by the way, we're going to call this fence a border, which, by the way, a fence is not a border. Gaza is not a separate country. They never bring that up. Let's continue.
Nonsense.
Oh, it's the most ridiculous thing.
It's the most ridiculous.
Hey, ceasefire. I was just raped though. Yeah, but now it's a ceasefire.
Ceasefire, exactly. Yeah. Selective timing of this.
I'm still
so our job is diplomatically to stand against all that nonsense. But I don't want to be one of these people shrieking. I mean, Nikki Haley was screeching on air, finish them, with a vague reference to almost Iran was what she invoked right before she said that. And then you talk about Mike Pence, just do it. It's like a Nike. Finish them is from like Mortal Kombat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just do it is like a Nike slogan. So they're like misappropriating corporate slogans as though that's our foreign. But Lindsey Graham, he said something equivalent to this.
Now, to be fair, I did say kill every.
Did you hear what he almost said? I wish he would have finished that because I want to add something to that piece when he's talking about the slogans.
Single line is rehearsed, and then you can see sometimes where he looks out like a kid who just told a joke, but it's inappropriate because it's in front of adults. Like, this joke didn't land, man. I just wish that people would be more authentic. Well, can we delineate though? And we've talked about this obviously in the last couple of weeks, the last week or so, with Israel Hamas.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between Ukraine and Russia.
Big difference.
In that Hamas is a terrorist organization where the extermination.
Went back too far. Sorry. Here we go.
Ceasefire.
Yeah, exactly. All that nonsense.
Oh, it's the most ridiculous thing.
It's the most ridiculous.
Hey, ceasefire. I was just raped though. Yeah, but now it's a ceasefire.
Ceasefire. Exactly. Yeah. Selective timing of this.
I'm still sure.
So our job is diplomatically to stand against all that nonsense. But I don't want to be one of these people shrieking. I mean, Nikki Haley was screeching on air, finish them, with a vague reference to almost Iran was what she invoked right before she said that. And then you talk about Mike Pence, just do it. It's like a Nike. Finish them is from like Mortal Kombat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just do it is like a Nike slogan. So they're like misappropriating corporate slogans as though that's our foreign. But Lindsey Graham, what?
That part right there, when he says misappropriating corporate slogans as though that's our foreign policy. But in a way, corporations are involved. Ask yourself why BlackRock is investing in Ukraine. That's something to think about. He didn't finish it. He didn't finish what he was saying, but corporations are involved in our foreign policy.
He said something equivalent to this.
Now, to be fair, I did say kill every last one of Hamas. Absolutely. Every last member of Hamas.
And that's Israel's decision to make.
Right.
And so Israel's making those decisions. I trust them to do the right thing. But we have to be.
Why does he trust them to do the right thing? Because he was told to? It's interesting to me that it's gotten to the point that even he's Republican, but even the Democrat politicians, now all of a sudden the extreme right wing is not of a concern. The same Democrat politicians that tell you we have to get rid of the extreme crazy right wing presence in the United States. Those same politicians like a Hakeem Jeffries and a Richie Torres have no problem siding and agreeing with extreme right-wing Netanyahu. No problem. They have no problem. Jamal Bowman as well. This is why I continue to tell you both parties are corporate, both parties are corrupt. When it comes to certain things, they are bipartisan. When it comes to the military-industrial complex, they're bipartisan. When it comes to war, they're bipartisan. When it comes to corporate interests, they're bipartisan. The only time they seem to be not bipartisan and working together is when it comes to the people. And even when it comes to the American people, the Democratic Party will give us a little bit of things. They'll give us crumbs, but they're not going to actually make changes to our lives, make changes in this country that's actually going to impact and benefit American people. They're not going to give everybody health care, for example. But when it comes to war, both parties are on board. When it comes to corporate interests, both parties are on board. And even when it comes to this right-wing extremism abroad, seems like to me, both parties seem to be on board.
Very careful not to sleepwalk or emotionally outburst ourselves into another broad regional conflict that in the Middle East that the U.S. is enmeshed in with ground troops or otherwise. This is when we've made our worst foreign policy disastrous mistakes in the past. So if I'm talking to Bibi, I would say, listen up, we got your back. Mm-hmm. You're on the right side of this. Don't let anybody stand in your way from defending yourself, and we've got your back on that. But my advice to you.
You see it? We got your back. We got your back. All the things that you've done to the Palestinian people, don't worry, we got your back. And what's really interesting is, and this is why I continue to say Vivek Ramaswamy is a freaking fraud, is what's really interesting about this, a lot of the Islamophobia that's happening in the country right now that I told you I've seen before, after September 11, it has returned. Given what's happening with Israel and Palestine, we'll show you a story that happened, something that happened to a 6-year-old little boy in a minute. You have to remember, and I want to be very clear, Vivek Ramaswamy is not Christian. When he does his speeches, he always say, we got to worry about country and God, but he don't tell you which God. And people can have whatever religion they want, as far as I'm concerned. But the party that Vivek Ramaswamy is running in is not on board with his religion. But Vivek Ramaswamy is okay here to condemn the... Let's go on.
Would be that we've made some of our poorest decisions in the wake of real disaster. That was your 9/11. We had our 9/11 here. And we entered disastrous multi-decade commitments in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And 20 years later, it did not do us an iota of good.
There's a little bit of a difference, so I will say.
And so just be careful.
Yeah, be careful. Say. But if you're comparing it as a percentage of the population, I think it would roughly
36 times, what it was.
Yeah, 20 to 30,000 Americans. And they live right there, and it's never,
But here's all I would say is, though, let's say, as awful as this would have been, as 30 times as many people died on 9/11 as they did.
And Canada did it.
Well, and going to Iraq still has nothing to do with that. Right. So I'm just making the point that we've made some of our worst decisions in response to emotional reactions to really, truly disastrous things that needed to be dealt with.
Right.
Targeted response, get rid of bin Laden, get rid of the Taliban. Absolutely. Get rid of Al Qaeda hiding in the caves, the people who were responsible for this, which, by the way, was a far more complicated story than the U.S. government let out until the declassified files came out 20 years later. Sure. Go actually get the real job done rather than using an emotional response to do something that literally might be an orthogonal objective, but in the mental haze and in the mental fog of war, we've made some of our worst decisions, so have other countries in their history. That's Israel's decision to make, but my job as the next U.S. president is to look after American interests, and I do not think we want to be entrenched in another long, drawn-out, U.S.-involved regional broad conflict in the Middle East that would not advance American interests. But there are easy ways we ought to support Israel diplomatically with intelligence sharing.
Let me pause there for a second. So you see what he's doing? So what he's telling you is that he really does not believe that the U.S. should be involved in another drawn-out war, right? He continues to say that Israel should have that response, that he trusts that the decisions that Israel is going to make. He doesn't really believe that the U.S. should be involved. But at the same time, he'll tell you that he supports Israel. And so there does seem to be this divide. Like I said, there was a conversation, I think I'll cover this maybe Thursday. There was a conversation in reference to Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson. They are split on this issue. Tucker Carlson does not think the U.S. should be involved. Of course, Ben Shapiro does think the U.S. Should be involved. But notice what they do. He'll pivot back to, I'm concerned about the interest right here in the U.S. and the American people. That's kind of a way for him to not say which side he would take or what he would do as president. But I got news for you, Vivek. If you're president of the United States, foreign policy is a part of that job. Part of that is commander in chief. That is part of your role. So if you are president, you can't just say, yeah, I don't know, I'm just going to take care of American interests. You are going to have to make a decision in reference to a conflict of Israel and Palestine, in reference to Russia and Ukraine. This is just a fact. That is part of the job. So it's like he's trying to walk in the middle a little bit. Let me let him finish and then we'll go to the next clip.
I mean, heck, we don't even have an ambassador to Israel right now. Confirm an ambassador to Israel in Egypt and other countries where we don't have confirmed ambassadors right now.
We start with no money to Iran at all.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And no money to Hamas.
Yeah. $6 billion. Yes, exactly.
I mean, there's been, but even indirect aid to Hamas that's actually been going through in the name of humanitarian aid or otherwise.
Yeah, right.
Deport anybody in this country who has had any ties to Hamas or otherwise, extradite them to Israel. So there are things we ought to absolutely be doing. I know. But there's also some things that nobody else is talking about that we ought to be talking about. We have to make sure that we oversee full phase out through the monitoring and agreements of Iran's nuclear program. But what the heck are we thinking with the Biden administration, with some Republicans cheering it along, talking about nuclear technology transfer to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
We should not want nuclear proliferation of any kind in the Middle East, and definitely not in Iran, but not in Saudi Arabia either. And yet nobody's talking
of any kind. So that means that no one should have it. Because when you say of any kind, I'm thinking no one should have it. That includes the United States. That includes China. That includes Russia. That includes every country when you say no one.
Talking about that right now. So I think this is a moment for level-headed rationality rather than emotional knee-jerk responses. And now it's a cool thing, right? It's what the cool kids do, criticize the Iraq war 20 years ago in either party. It's the cool, easy thing to do because it's long past and there's no consequence to you to do it. I'm not patting myself on the back. I was in college at the time, but I was against the Iraq war then. I had a bunch of other harebrained ideas that I was dead wrong on, but that wasn't one of them. Yeah. And that was a left-wing position then, even though I wasn't on the left. I consider myself a libertarian back then. But now it's easy to do that now. But the hard part is in the thick and the heat of the moment to make sure you don't make that same mistake, but it's not going to relate to Iraq. It might relate to Iran or abroad.
We'll go ahead and pause it there. It's really interesting because I showed a video when he was in college where he was at Al Sharpton's event at Harvard University. He was there also with Pete Buttigieg. They just happened to be at the same Al Sharpton event when he was running for president, and both of them were actually selected as speakers to come forward and ask a question. Interesting how that works, right? Yeah, but he says he was a libertarian. Now, it gets deeper because other countries are coming out against Israel's decisions. And one of those countries, and this one really threw me for a loop, and that was Spain. This is new. Spain has come forward and said, today we raise our voice to denounce that Israel is carrying out a genocide in Gaza. We ask the government of Spain to bring Netanyahu before the International Criminal Court for war crimes. We're just going to play just a little of this. Again, this is Spain.
Buenos días, bon día, egunon, vos días. Me dirijo a todas vosotras y vosotros con el corazón.
I address all of you with a heavy heart by the image. I think they mean images. Images coming from Palestine.
Son absolutamente encogido por las imágenes que nos llegan desde Palestina. Desde Podemos no somos indiferentes al atroz sufrimiento que el pueblo palestino lleva viviendo durante décadas.
So they are not indifferent to the suffering that Palestinians have been experiencing for decades.
Hoy queremos alzar nuestra voz para denunciar que el Estado de Israel está llevando a cabo un genocidio planificado en la franja.
Okay, so they said that they condemn what the state of Israel is doing, carrying out a genocide among the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, leaving hundreds of thousands of people without light, food, and water, and carrying out bombings.
De Gaza, dejando sin luz, sin comida y sin agua a cientos de miles de personas y llevando a cabo bombardeos sobre población civil que son un castigo colectivo, incumplen gravemente el derecho internacional.
Says on the civilian population that our collective punishment seriously breach international law.
Y pueden considerarse crímenes de guerra. Ante esto, Estados Unidos y la Unión Europea no es solo que miren hacia otro lado.
She calls them war crimes, and she goes on to say that the U.S. and the European Union, that the EU, they cannot be neutral on this.
Es que están jaleando al Estado de Israel en su política de apartheid y de ocupación.
She says that they are encouraging the state of Israel in reference to apartheid.
Que vulnera gravemente los derechos humanos. Usar los terribles asesinatos de civiles israelíes por parte de las facciones armadas palestinas como excusa para justificar los crímenes de Israel en general y la
They are using it as an excuse to justify Israel's crimes in general, and the massacre in Gaza in particular is unacceptable.
masacre en Gaza en particular es algo absolutamente inaceptable. El Estado de Israel, su primer ministro y su partido han reconocido en numerosas ocasiones que promocionaron a Hamás para debilitar a los sectores laicos de la.
It says that Israel and also Netanyahu, they have acknowledged that on occasions that they promoted Hamas to weaken the secular sectors of the Palestinian resistance. This is the piece I think that a lot of people are missing, is that it's not like Hamas just came out of nowhere. It was promoted by the state of Israel. And we have to continue to stress that to people, because I think a lot of people are not aware of that, especially if they're just watching mainstream media. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was created, it was promoted for a reason by the state of Israel. Now, I want to see Anderson Cooper say that.
La resistencia palestina. Usar a Hamas como una excusa para asesinar millares de civiles palestinos y.
And we'll finish here because this is a long video, but using Hamas as an excuse to murder thousands of Palestinian civilians, including children, is unspeakable. Again, that is coming from Spain. So Spain is not with it. With that, they said, no, we are actually condemning what the state of Israel is doing. And then we also have Colombia. Colombia condemns genocide in Gaza, threatens to sever ties with Israel. And this brings me to another question. Are we going to see another shift in reference to diplomatic relations with countries across the world? We see Spain is speaking up. We see Colombia is speaking up. You know, is it possible that a country like Spain, for example, may say, you know what, we're not down with this? What if Spain left the EU? These are things to think about. Some of these other countries, BRICS is taking applications. Goes on to say here, I'll just read a little bit. There's Gustavo. Says Petro denounced the genocide carried out by the Israeli occupation aircraft in Gaza, demanding that the protection of health sector workers. He went on to stress that systematic attacks on civilians and genocide must be stopped and international law adhered to. The basic needs of life must be protected in Gaza, he added, announcing that Colombia would send humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. The Israeli occupation foreign minister responded saying Israel decided to stop security exports to Colombia. According to Israeli media, Tel Aviv summoned its Colombian ambassador in protest against Petro's statements. So he responded and said, if we have to suspend foreign relations with Israel, we will suspend them. We do not support genocides. The president of Colombia will not be insulted. So Colombia clapped back. Now, today, there was a hospital attacked in Gaza. Now, Rashida Tlaib tweeted this. Israel just bombed the Baptist hospital, killing 500 Palestinians, doctors, children, patients, just like that. POTUS, this is what happens when you refuse to facilitate a ceasefire and help de-escalate. Your war and destruction only approach has opened my eyes and many Palestinian Americans and Muslim Americans like me. We will remember where you stood. And so I just want to say this, Rashida Tlaib, are you willing to take back your endorsement of Joe Biden? Because otherwise this means nothing. Because if you're not willing to take back your public endorsement of Joe Biden, this statement here doesn't mean anything. Just keeping it real. Now, there have been many different stories about this. Israel said that they weren't the ones that actually attacked the hospital. They're saying that Hamas actually attacked the hospital by a misfire, but there have been multiple media networks that have said different things. A lot of people don't really know. I know the Gray Zone actually covered this earlier today. They were interviewing a Palestinian gentleman who was talking about this. They're saying that technically, based on the technology and the disaster that came from it, that you can tell that it actually came from Israel. In fact, Eric, I didn't send you this, but I'm about to pull this up real quick because this video came through. And I do want to make sure I show this. It's from another news outlet, and they're going to tell you how they know that it actually came from Israel. Hold on, let me put it up here for a second. Okay, there he is. Listen to this. Because there's been a lot of lies that have been told since this all started. It says BBC journalist says the attack on the Al-Ali National Baptist Hospital in Gaza had to be done by Israel. Listen to what he says for his reasoning.
The Israeli military has been contacted for comment, and they have said that they are investigating. But, it is hard to see what else this could be, really, given the size of the explosion, other than an Israeli airstrike or several airstrikes, because, when we've seen rockets being fired out of Gaza, we never see explosions of that scale. We might see half a dozen, maybe a few more people being killed in such rocket attacks, but we've never seen anything on the scale of the sort of explosion on the video I was watching earlier, which, as you say, is still to be verified. The Israeli military has...
Okay, I wanted to play that for a reason. Remember, when we talk about resources, who has more advanced technology, even when it comes to the weapons? Israel does. So what they were saying on the BBC is that because of the scale of the attack, the scale of the explosion, they're saying there's no way that that could have come from Hamas. So you see, different media outlets are saying different things, but it's very obvious what's happening here. It's very obvious. You know that our politicians, a lot of them are in bed. Pull this up. A lot of our politicians are in bed with the Israeli lobby. We've talked about this before on the show. A lot of them are supported or endorsed by AIPAC. We talked about how AIPAC has actually come together to push out certain voices that don't 100% go against the Palestinian people. Even if you say that both people deserve to have the same rights, they still will come out and attack you and smear you and put up money to make sure that you're not reelected or elected in the first damn place. So we know what's happening here. There is a narrative that is being controlled. And had it not been for independent media, and had it not been for the people, the thousands of people who came out in the streets across this country and across the world, they would still be telling that narrative. Think about it. Think about how it's always from one side. It is the independent journalists that are going into Gaza and reporting. Anderson Cooper is standing on top of a balcony in Tel Aviv. I don't see Anderson Cooper putting on a helmet and going in Gaza. None of them. Now, I want to go ahead and transition into what this is causing to happen. I told you earlier, again, at the beginning of the story, I'm starting to see another rise in Islamophobia. And I also want to say, first and foremost, not everyone that's Palestinian is Muslim, but even if they were, so what? There are Palestinians in Palestine that are Christian, that are Jewish. Not all of them are Muslim. But this type of hateful rhetoric has been going on for a long time. Now, I want to start with this statement that came from Ben Shapiro, and then we're going to go ahead and move to the story about the 6-year-old little boy. And I'm going to tell you how this spreads. So this is when Ben Shapiro was on the BBC and he was called out for his statements about Palestinians. Listen to this.
Let me try to point out some of the things you've said that seem to me to help to stoke that anger. For example, you said Israelis like to build, Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage.
Well, as I say in an article entitled, here's a list of all the giant, bad, dumb things I've ever said.
Was that dumb?
Yes, that's a dumb tweet. And not only, but it is also important to mention that the next few tweets clarify that that tweet is specifically referring to the Hamas leadership, which, by the way, a BBC I've seen is relatively reticent to condemn.
No, actually, it wasn't. What you went on to do and say, you are correct about the slur on Arabs. It's not all Arabs that want to live in open sewage and blow things up. It's just Palestinians. You went on to say.
You hear that? These things happened. See, people tweet things and they forgot what they tweeted. These things happened. This type of rhetoric is why people, particularly Americans, have the belief that they do about people.
Blow things up. It's just Palestinians. You went on to say.
No, it's just the ones who take sides against Israel in the Israel-Palestinian conflict.
Population is rotten to the core. You went on to say, not Hamas, the Palestinian Arab population.
So this is a part of the problem, is that people are starting to, when they talk about Hamas, they make it sound like that's all of the Palestinians, that they're all this. That's one group, right? Just like you've had radical groups in the United States in reference to religion. And now this can bring up a whole nother discussion about religion and whether it's more harmful or helpful. We can get into all of that. Right? There have been many wars that have happened over religion, but there are different groups, right? So you have people that are Christians, and yes, there were some Christians that will go to abortion clinics and what will they do? They'll bomb the abortion clinics, right? Does that represent all Christians? No, it doesn't. What Ben Shapiro did there is he got busted, was that he tried to basically make it seem like all of Palestine was Hamas. He smeared those people. And that type of rhetoric, that type of hateful rhetoric leads to things like this. If you have not heard about this story, 6-year-old Muslim boy killed by the landlord. Listen to why. Listen to this.
Now to new warnings of potential threats here in the United States and growing fears that the war abroad could lead to trouble here at home after a horrific attack in Illinois that left a 6-year-old little boy dead. Our Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas is in Washington with that. Good morning, Pierre.
Lindsay, good morning. I want to warn you and our friends at home that what I'm about to tell you is incredibly heart-wrenching. It's fresh evidence that the FBI is right to fear that the carnage from the Israeli-Hamas war could spill over here at home. We learned that a 71-year-old landlord in a Chicago suburb viciously attacked 2 of his renters, fatally stabbing a 6-year-old boy and wounding his mother, simply because they were Muslim and apparently because of his pure hatred about what's happening in Israel. Police say he stabbed.
You hear that? You see what's happening, people? By the way, this is it. I saw this after September 11th. This is what happened. So to those of you who are commentators on mainstream media, you got an important job to do. When you tell these stories, the way you frame these stories, the narrative that's given to you by producers. Now you can do the right damn thing. And you can talk about what's happening to the Palestinian people too, not just what's happening to the state of Israel. And yeah, you may lose your job for it, but at least you'll have your morality and some type of ethics. Or you can continue to sit there and be a paid shill and have no integrity and just collect checks, which is what a lot of them are doing. And I'll say it again, had it not been for the mass movements that happened across the world, they wouldn't be coming back to retract some of the statements that they put out. And I'm going to show you a retraction in a second.
Have that little boy with Dia Al-Fayoum 26 times with a military-style knife. Attorney General Merrick Garland said late last night he was, quote, heartbroken and announced a federal hate crimes investigation. The FBI says the most immediate concern is that so-called lone wolves and other unstable individuals inflamed by the Israeli conflict will act out and harm whoever's near. I was in a telephone briefing with the FBI director and a couple of senior FBI officials yesterday, and Christopher Wray warned that he cannot discount the possibility that Hamas and other terrorist organizations could call on supporters to attack here at home. Serious times, guys.
Everybody see what's happening? That little boy, 6 years old, he was stabbed 26 times. 6 years old. Now, mainstream media, I'm looking at you because since day one, you've been smearing people, you've been smearing activists, you've been smearing protesters. Here comes the BBC having to make a retraction. Little too late, though, because they were smearing protesters as well.
Now, before we go, earlier on BBC News, we reported on some of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations at the weekend. We spoke about several demonstrations across Britain during which people voiced their backing for Hamas. We accept that this was poorly phrased and was a misleading description of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations. Now, here's the weather. Now, before we go, earlier on BBC News, we reported on some of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations at the weekend. We spoke about several demonstrations across Britain during which people voiced their backing for Hamas. We accept that this was poorly phrased and was a misleading description of the...
So I just want to say something really quick. That was another example of them basically saying anything that's pro-Palestinian means that you're supporting Hamas. That was just another example of that. Then she has the nerve to say at the end, now here's the weather. CNN journalist came forward and had to retract her statement. This is a mess. And then people wonder why. No one trusts mainstream media anymore. You guys are liars. A lot of these people sitting at these desks, they say they're commentators. Oh, I'm a journalist. I've listened to Anderson Cooper. I'm going to go off about him. I listened to Anderson Cooper for years. Say, oh, I'm a journalist, investigative journalist, and I da-da-da. You're not no damn journalist, Anderson Cooper. You read the teleprompter in front of you. You're not out here in the field, in these streets, getting stories from people. You read the script that they give you. You don't research a damn thing. They kill me with this. Oh, journalist so-and-so. These people are not journalists. And the real journalists, the ones who are in the thick of it, the ones who have gone to Gaza, you'll never see those people on those outlets. You'll never see them invite them on CNN or MSNBC. Some of them may get invited on Fox News, but that's only when the president is a Democrat, for the most part. But the real journalists, most Americans don't even know about. But here's the weather.
Pro-Palestinian demonstrations. Now, here's the weather. Now, before...
It's too late because the damage was already done. Already done. But that didn't stop people from showing solidarity. Harvard University students, after several of them being attacked because of the letter that students put out to express their appreciation for Palestine, that didn't stop them from protesting on the Harvard steps. These kids aren't dumb. I got to tell you, the younger kids, particularly those, I'd say college age, they are much further along than where I was when I was in undergrad. They have caught on to these things. Now, granted, we didn't have social media when I was in undergrad, but they're very much awake. They know what's going on. They know what's happening to the Palestinian people. And when we look at the protests happening globally, I want to show you what that looked like. When I said globally, it's globally. Now, shout out to Alan, because Alan been keeping track of all this. Here's Spain. That's Spain. A lot of people, right? He has so many more. Amsterdam. Look at all those people. The people know. The people know. They're not stupid. They know what's happening. There's more. London. So even in the UK, people know what's up. Look at all the people.
No civilized nation on earth would agree that depriving children of food and water is acceptable. I'm here because I'm a human being, and anyone with a conscience believes that a civilian population should never be punished in this way. It's collective punishment. It's a war crime. And unless we stop it, unless we get out there and say something, it's going to end up with thousands losing their lives.
Can you put into words how you feel about the loss of life on both sides?
Every life is precious. But the root of this violence is the occupation. It's not complicated.
That part right there is very important for people to hear. It's not complicated. I get so tired of people telling me that, well, you don't understand, it's complicated. No, it's not complicated. It's really not. France, even though Macron has threatened to make this criminal, you know that doesn't stop the French from coming up and showing out. You know that does not stop them from showing out. So that's France. Lots of people, right? And I believe we got one more. We have Ireland. See, people know, man. They understand what's happening to those people. That's Dublin. Awesome, right? All over the world. And I just actually featured the rally that was in Boston. I did find out the head count after I recorded that yesterday. So if you haven't had a chance to watch the Boston rally, check that out. That it premiered earlier this afternoon on my show. But the head count, they said the final head count was 5,000 people. And I believe it because it was a lot of people in these streets. But we got to stand up to this, man. We got to stand up to this. And we'll say this again, because I think some people confused. There is a difference between the state of Israel and Jewish people and Zionism. Not everyone that's Jewish is a Zionist. In fact, everyone that I know that is Jewish is not. Not everyone that is a Zionist is Jewish. Paging RFK Jr.